During the Great Depression of the 1930s, Keynes spearheaded a revolution in economic thinking, challenging the ideas of classical economics that held that free markets would, in the short to medium term, automatically provide full employment, as long as workers were flexible in their wage demands. Many countries suffered from a severe decline in economic activity. From the end of 1920s to the early 1930s, the world experienced a 15% decline in GDP. The Great Depression had damaging effects on economies across the world, with some countries experiencing an unemployment rate as high as over 30%. In most countries, the Depression started in 1929 and did not end until the late 1930s. The Depression first started in the US, where the stock market crashed in October 1929. On October 28th and 29th, the Dow Jones Industrial Index fell by over 20%. There are several plausible explanations for the Great Depression. Some have argued that the sharp reduction in consumption and investment was due to a large-scale loss of confidence, which led to a severe drop in aggregate demand. Others argue that the Great Depression was the result of contractionary monetary policy that exacerbated the impacts on an ordinary recession and turned it into an economic depression. One of the solutions to the Great Depression proposed by Keynes was to stimulate the economy by increasing government spending. Indeed, massive increases in government expenditures undertook by Frank Delano Roosevelt's administration, especially at the beginning of World War II, helped the US economy to recover. Notwithstanding all of the historical context, the persistent unemployment and weak economic recovery provided fertile ground for Keynes' ideas. In 1936, he published his famous book, The General Theory of Unemployment, Interest, and Money. It provided a conceptual framework where equilibrium output could be below full employment, and offered policy options to promote employment and economic activity. Prior to Keynes' research, mainstream macroeconomics was based on classical economics that focused on aggregate supply of an economy, according to which recessions are caused by reduced capacity of producers. However, Keynes argued that the Great Depression was, instead, driven by a lack of aggregate demand, and that the government could stimulate the economy through fiscal and monetary policies. His ideas became orthodoxy and the dominant tool of macroeconomic analysis and policy advising well until the 1970s, when high periods of both inflation and low growth led its influence to wane and marked a return of micro-founded models to modern macro. Some of Keynes's ideas were summarized in a mathematical model known as the ISLM model. IS stands for investment savings, and LM stands for liquidity preference, money supply. It is a short-run model of economic activity and assumes full price rigidity, where the economy can be below full employment in equilibrium, an appealing characteristic in Western economies in the aftermath of the Great Depression. It pins down short-run equilibrium output using the dynamics of the investment savings behavior, IS curve, versus liquidity preferences motives, LM curve. Here is pictured John Hicks, that elaborated the first ISLM diagrams, since the general theory was only verbose. The closed economy national macroeconomic identity is given by Y equals C plus I plus G, which holds by definition. In fact, statistically speaking, investment I also includes the involuntary inventory accumulation of unsold firm products. Keynes, 1936, Hicks in 1937, and so forth, instead interpret this equation as an equilibrium relationship between aggregate supply and aggregate demand, which only holds if GDP and the real interest rate are linked in a specific way, represented by the IS curve. In this interpretation, Y is production output, C is households consumption, I is investment voluntarily undertaken by private firms, and G is exogenously given public expenditure. Let us assume that C is planned by consumers based on disposable income, while I, investment, is planned by firms based on the interest rate. More in detail, we'll assume the planned consumption increases with output net of taxes, while planned investment decreases with a real interest rate. Hence, the goods market equilibrium is given by the following equation, where G and T are the only variables that are independent of Y and R that are exogenous to the private sector. This implicitly defines R as a decreasing function of Y. For its simplicity, let's assume a linear consumption function. Lowercase c, smaller than 1 in absolute value, is called the marginal propensity to consume. We can now solve the goods market equilibrium for output and get the following expression. In this figure, we plot the infinite combination of output levels and interest rates, such that the goods market for consumption and investment is always in equilibrium. The intuition behind the IS curve is that the higher real interest rate reduces investment, which in turn leads to a decrease in output. We now turn to the money market. Remember that the money market equilibrium is given by money supply over the price level, equating the demand for real balances, D, which is a function of output and the nominal rate. Since we are assuming constant prices, there is no difference between the nominal and interest rates. This means R equals I. Hence, we can write the demand for real balances as a function of the real rate. Note that the function D increases in output and decreases in the interest rate, but has to be equal to a constant ms over p. Hence, any increase in output which raises money demand needs to be offset by a corresponding increase in the interest rate, which reduces money demand, in order for the money market to remain in equilibrium. This means that there is an implicit positive relationship between output and the interest rate, corresponding to the money market equilibrium, the liquidity preferences versus money supply curve, or commonly known as the LM curve. This positive relationship between output and interest rates is depicted in this figure and represents the infinite combination between both such that the money market is in equilibrium. The intersection of the IS and LM curves shows the equilibrium level of output, Y star, and the equilibrium interest rate, R star, in the economy. In this framework, since financial markets operate much faster than the goods markets, the interest rate will quickly adjust to guarantee that the economy is always on the LM curve. In fact, while firms faced with excess demand or supply of goods may take months or weeks to adjust their production plans, employment decisions, and so on, in the case of excess demand or supply of money and bonds, financial markets take minutes, if not seconds, to reach the money market equilibrium. We now turn our attention to the impacts of fiscal policy in the ISLM framework. Remember the equilibrium in the goods market. An increase in government expenditures leads to a parallel shift to the right in the IS curve. This leads to a movement along the LM curve and a new equilibrium. In fact, public expenditure G raises aggregate demand, which encourages firms to produce and employ more, which generates more income, such as wages, profits, and so forth, for families, raising the demand for money and lowering that of bonds. The bond price will decline, and the interest rate R will increase. This mechanism works only if there are enough underutilized resources, such as physical capital and labor, so that firms will meet the increased demand with an increased production. Hence, it mainly works during recessions. It also needs prices and wages not to change too fast, otherwise full employment would be automatically restored. It is possible that similar shifts in the IS curve are driven by changes in investor sentiment, denoted by epsilon. We could incorporate such psychological factors into the investment function by writing it as an increasing function of the sentiment parameter epsilon plus the interest rate. More optimistic investors, higher epsilon, will then shift the IS curve up and lead to a higher equilibrium output and interest rate. More pessimistic investors, lower epsilon, will shift the IS curve down and lead to a lower equilibrium output and interest rates. Hence, optimistic or pessimistic sentiments will be self-fulfilled. Let's turn our attention now to monetary policy. The central bank can print money and buy bonds, which will increase the total supply of money, MS. This translates into a parallel shift of the LM curve to the right and a movement along the IS curve. This will increase the bond price and decrease the interest rate. Consequently, firms' physical capital investment will rise, thereby raising aggregate demand. As a consequence, the equilibrium value of output, Y star, increases, while the equilibrium interest rate, R star, decreases. In the general theory, Keynes mentions that there is the possibility that after the rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, liquidity preference may become virtually absolute in the sense that almost everyone prefers cash to holding a debt, which yields so low a rate of interest, something that became known as a liquidity trap. In this event, the monetary authority would have lost effective control over the rate of interest. But whilst this limiting case might become practically important in the future, I know of no example of it hitherto. Later, Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, following the original formulations of Hicks, commented on Japan's situation of very low interest rates, that a liquidity trap may be defined as a situation in which conventional monetary policies have become impotent because nominal interest rates are at or near zero. Injecting monetary base into the economy has no effect because the monetary base and bonds are viewed by the private sector as perfect substitutes. A common critique of the ISLM model is that the central bank normally sets the interest rate rather than the level of money supply when conducting monetary policy. For example, when the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee meets to conduct monetary policy, which it does 12 times a year, the committee sets the Bank of England base rate, which is the official interest rate in the United Kingdom. We can accommodate this by replacing the LM curve with a monetary policy, MP rule. A simple MP rule is that the monetary authority exogenously sets the nominal interest rate I. Then, our assumption of zero inflation in the short run implies that the monetary authority is also able to influence the real interest rate. Therefore, we specify a very simple monetary policy as follows. This translates simply into an horizontal LM curve. We assume that the IS curve is still the same, and now the goods market equilibrium is given by this condition. An increase in the policy rate R bar leads to an upward shift of the monetary policy line and vice versa. This became known as the investment savings monetary policy model. So far, we have assumed a completely fixed price level that implies zero inflation rate in the short run. This is a very extreme assumption. Some degree of price rigidity does not necessarily imply a completely fixed aggregate price level. Therefore, sticky prices do not necessarily imply a zero inflation rate. It is now time to explore the behavior of inflation by introducing to the ISMP model an additional component, namely the Phillips curve. The resulting ISMP-PC model is often referred to as the three-equation Keynesian model. The Phillips curve, named after William Phillips, specifies a positive relationship between inflation, pi, and the level of output, y. In his seminal paper, he actually focused on the negative relationship between unemployment and the growth rate of nominal wages, wage inflation, for the UK economy. Given that unemployment and output are inversely related, the negative relationship between unemployment and inflation implies a positive relationship between output and inflation. The version of the Phillips curve we will consider is the following. Inflation is equal to expected inflation plus theta times the difference between output and potential output, or, in other words, the output gap. The parameter theta greater than 0 determines how sensitive inflation pi is to changes in output. Y bar is the long-run level of output determined by economic growth. Given that this is a short-run model, we take potential output as given. With respect to inflation expectations, there are many ways we can model them. Here, we consider a simple formulation. Inflation expectations just equal inflation in the previous year. That is, pi e equals pi t minus 1. In order to allow inflation to affect output, we need a more general monetary policy rule. The more general version of the monetary policy curve that we consider here is given by setting the real rate equal to the natural rate plus ρ times the inflation gap, that is, the difference between inflation and the inflation target. The parameter ρ is positive and smaller than 1 and determines how sensitive the interest rate is to changes in inflation. When ρ equals 0, we go back to the same equation we had before with an horizontal MP curve. However, in general, ρ is greater than 0, and thus a decrease in the inflation rate will lead the monetary authority to lower the interest rate. The intuition behind this policy response is that lower inflation may be caused by a weakening economy, so the central bank should cut the interest rate to stimulate the economy. So we now substitute the MP curve into the IS equation from before and obtain the following negative relationship between output, Y, and the inflation rate, pi. Intuitively, a higher inflation leads to an increase in the interest rate, which in turn depresses investment and output. This equation is essentially an aggregate demand curve that describes a negative relationship between inflation and output. The Phillips curve can also be interpreted as an aggregate supply curve that describes a positive relationship between inflation and output. Notice that both aggregate demand and supply postulate negative and positive, respectively, relationships between inflation and aggregate economic activity. As such, we can plot them both in this figure and show the equilibrium level of output and inflation for the economy. Suppose now we consider the effects of this inflation by the central bank, that is, a decrease in the inflation target. This figure shows that the decrease in the inflation target shifts down the aggregate demand curve. Intuitively, the decrease in the inflation target causes the central bank to respond by raising the interest rate, which in turn depresses investment and output in the short run. After one period, the decrease in the equilibrium inflation rate causes inflation expectations to fall, as expected inflation equals inflation in the previous period, which in turn shifts down the aggregate supply curve. This shift in the AS curve causes a further decrease in inflation, but also an increase in output. After two periods, the decrease in inflation causes inflation expectations to adjust downwards again, which in turn shifts down the AS curve again. This process continues until the level of output returns to the long-run level, as we can see in this figure. In the long run, the level of output returns to its initial level, though at a lower level of inflation. This simple yet powerful framework was, and in some cases still is, the main tool of analysis for the conduction of fiscal and monetary policy. However, it involves ad hoc assumptions, such as the relationships between consumption and income and the relationship between investment and the interest rate that are assumed, as opposed to being derived from optimizing rational behavior of households and firms. Modern macroeconomic models are capable of capturing some important insights from this framework, while deriving aggregate behavior from individual optimization and first principles, as we saw with the sticky prices, price misperceptions, and nominal wage rigidity models.